Hi everyone, it's William with the Grand Duke Dmitri 1939 series, and today we're going to start a new letter, so I'm excited about that. It's a good one. It's an undated letter for October 1939. It was probably about midway between the 23rd of September letter and the one that we just finished, which was dated 27th of October. Before we get started with that, I want to say a quick word about who was at the sanatorium with Dmitri. So you had, I've mentioned several times, I think, you had lists of patients that were actually published every 1 week during the high season and every 2 weeks during the low season. And so it's possible to know who was there. And because of the outbreak of the war, they had to suspend publication so the last one was before the war was published on the 25th of August, so only a few days before the war broke out. And the next one wasn't published until the 17th of November. And Dmitri, of course, arrived on the 3rd of September, or rather, he checked in as a patient. And so ordinarily he would have appeared a week later on the guest list. But in this instance, his name doesn't appear till 17th of November. But if we look at the guest list, or the patients list, I should say, for the 25th of August, and then at the one for the 17th of November, we can kind of get a pretty good idea of what was going on. So lots of people had left, which was unusual because usually people stayed away during the summer and came back in the late fall. It was unusual for it to be the other way around, but in this instance, there had been more people in August, a lot of people, 96, which was really good, house almost full. But then in November, it had dropped off to 70 people. And so what would it have been like for Dmitri there? Well, one of the reasons I wanted to bring up this guest list was because he talks a lot about patriotism and politics. And Schatzalp was such an international community. So there were, at the time that his name first appears in the 17th November list, there were people there from 20 different countries. There were 70 people, including him, and coming from 20 different countries. The gender ratio was somewhat skewed. They tended to try and keep it balanced. But in this instance, there were more men than women. There were 30 women and 40 men, one of whom was Dmitri. And what did you have for the nationalities? Well, I can go down the list. So out of 70 people, you had 13 Germans, 11 English, 9 Portuguese, 7 Irish, 5 Belgians, 5 French, 4 Swiss, 2 from Czechoslovakia, 2 from Holland, and 1 each from Brazil, the Dutch East Indies, Finland, Hungary, Iraq, Italy, Poland, Romania, Russia, Spain, and Yugoslavia. So Dmitri was the one Russian. So usually the nationality that's listed maybe wasn't the person's nationality, it's the place where they permanently resided. But in the case of Dmitri, he did not permanently reside in Russia, as we know. He hadn't been there since the end of 1916. But people did have some say in how they were going to be listed. And so he was listed as coming from Russia. So anyway, we can talk about more of his fellow patients later. He does mention a few of them. He wasn't being very social while he was there, but some of the people who are mentioned in the patients list are people that he also mentions in the diaries. Okay, so a recap for the last section of the last letter. Well, I think you'll find that he is going to be in a much different mood this time, because he wasn't in a great mood in the one we just finished. He was in a great mood on the 23rd of September, and then you see a really marked difference in the letter of 27th October, and he's kind of sparring with Maria a little bit. And this one is closer to the one of 23rd of September. He's still in a good mood. He's not. You see on the 27th of October that he's starting to be rather distrustful and cynical about the doctors. And as of the time that he was writing this one, he still wasn't. He was still very optimistic and was believing what they told him about that he should be optimistic. I kind of wish that I'd done the video for this one first because, yeah, I have an old man brain. I forget about things, and there were things that really confused me in the one that we just finished of the 27th, but this one really clears a lot of those things up, so I'm a little bit embarrassed about having been confused what he was talking about in the previous one. So it's cool now to be looking at this one because it sheds so much light on the other one. And our cast today is very small. It's primarily just Audrey. Oh, Peter the Great gets a mention. Okay, so here we go. Let's see how far we get. Dearest! Exclamation point. Thanks for the letter. It was very interesting. How well I understand what Europeans in America must be going through right now while this horrible drama unfolds. That's just what I wrote to Audrey the other day. I said that we, or me, or anybody else, we feel a sort of collective patriotism towards Europe, and to be out of it during these times would be awful. That was my response to her suggestion that I should come to America for treatment. But even setting that consideration aside, it would be extremely foolish for me to go to America now because it would set my treatment back 4 to 5 weeks, and that would be almost the same as starting over from the beginning. Unfortunately, I have no news beyond my own health. I would really love to talk about politics, but it's difficult. It would be interesting to learn from the Poles themselves whether they would prefer to live in the German-occupied half of their country or in the half occupied by the Red troops, who are already executing prelates, imprisoning landowners, shooting Polish officers, and arming the proletariat. These atrocities are sometimes described in the Swiss press and on Swiss radio. They don't report on them often, but when they do, they provide full details, as well as describing the frightful condition of the former Polish army, whose soldiers lack boots and bullets, their rifles are not of consistent caliber, and whose officers are terrible! Exclamation point. Yes! Exclamation point. The implications of the war are in a state of flux at the moment. The axis is shifting, and this is axis with a small a. He's not talking about the axis, countries. And even if National Socialism is completely defeated, what can be done about the communists? Why does democracy fight only against Adolf and not against Stalin too? Because even in the best case scenario, i.e. total victory, only half of Poland will be liberated! Exclamation point. The other half will have to be snatched from the Russian bear is in quotation marks, which is still assuring England that it is entirely neutral. So fighting against National Socialism is one thing, but God forbid that communism should be fought. That might displease His Majesty's opposition. Yes, they abandon humanity, abandon ideals, abandon cherished political ideas, and they do not know themselves anymore. Sorry, double exclamation point. But the French communists, they, meaning the French government, have even dissolved parliament so that they can deprive the Red deputies of their immunity. God, how I would like to continue on in this vein. I could write pages and pages, but even a little bit more would be enough to ensure that the letter would never reach you, albeit here in Switzerland and in Italy, they are not opening letters just yet. By the way, the film Peter the Great reminded me of the pressure on the Baltic Sea and the Ukraine. Curious. All right, so I'll stop there. That's actually quite a lot. And yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things to comment on. I should say at the outset that this letter was not written in English. There are some English lines, like when he's talking about writing to Audrey, and he says, I said that we or me or anybody else, we feel a sort of collective patriotism towards Europe, and to be out of it during these times would be awful. That's his English. Pretty good. So if you recall, in the letter of the 27th, he was asking her if she'd gotten both of his letters, and he was worried that writing in Russian would be a problem. But she obviously had gotten this letter, and she answered it with respect to his political points. And, there was some disagreement between the two of them. But one thing that stands out with this is how amiably he's writing about Audrey. And she's urging him to come and do his cure in the United States. And they seem to be on very friendly terms. Whereas if you look at the next letter on the 27th, so at most, say, 2 or 3 weeks away, well, he's not happy with her. He's saying, laugh, 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 little lady. He's not happy with her at all. And of course, the big difference between the two is easy to infer. It's Polly. So Maria and Audrey had probably, in the meantime, written him and said, now you need to send Polly to the U.S. And so that changed everything. Okay, so this is his first mention of this idea of pan-European patriotism, which is interesting. I think he's a little too optimistic about his treatment because he seems to think that, it wouldn't be a problem. He's not at this point saying, oh, my illness is too severe for me to come to the U.S. He's just saying, basically, I don't want to. I want to be in Europe. But I think that would have been disastrous if he'd actually tried in the state he was in the shape he was in, to go. So now you recall on the 27th, he was talking a good deal about Poland. So now I understand. I was so confused the time before when he was talking about the Red atrocities, the Red tradition of killing bishops and putting landowners in the gulags and so on and so forth, all these horrible things. Well, what he meant was it's the Red tradition. Those things weren't being done in Russia anymore because there were no more bishops and landowners for them to worry about, or armed opponents of the government. What he's talking about is, of course, in Poland. So what the Red Army is doing in Poland. So that makes perfect sense to me. And again, he's talking about this interesting thought about, are the Poles going to be better off under the Soviets or under the Nazis? And of course, it wasn't, it was primarily Jews in Poland who were put obviously into the ghettos and into the concentration camps. But there were also quite a few non-Jewish Poles who ended up going to concentration camps and being killed. They were considered subhuman, the Poles. And so at that point, maybe there were still some Poles in the German-occupied area thinking, okay, maybe a few. I kind of doubt there were many. I would tend to believe that if you asked the Poles under German occupation who had it better, themselves or the Poles under Russian occupation, they probably would have said, oh, the ones that are under Soviet occupation, and vice versa. Those in the Soviet zone would probably say, oh, we wish we were in the German zone. Maybe. I don't know. I shouldn't say things like that because I have no idea. Anyway, it's interesting. It's very interesting. He has much more sympathy for the Poles now than he had in 1919. In 1919, even though Russia was under control of the Bolsheviks, Dmitri still wanted the part of Poland that had been part of the Russian Empire to be part of the Russian Empire. He didn't want it to be detached, so he was really strongly conflicted on that, whether he wanted the Poles to prevail or the Red Army. And this time, clearly, he does not want the Red Army to prevail, and he doesn't want that part of Poland that was formerly part of the Russian Empire. He doesn't want it to be part of the Soviet Empire. So that's interesting. That's quite a change. That's quite a change for him. And as we talked about last time, he's having less and less sympathy for Russia, at least less than he had in 1936, because in 1936, he was actually out there actively giving speeches and saying, let's be proud of what Stalin's doing and that sort of thing. So that's really interesting I mean, possibly even in 1938, because this friend that he's mentioned, Konstantin Grunwald, actually wrote a letter to Maria saying, oh, your brother met with, I think his name was Maisky, a Soviet envoy to London. He met with him, and he even seemed to be considering maybe going back to Russia. So if that was true, what a turnaround between 1938, between the speeches he was giving in 35 and 36 and the people he was meeting with in 1938. And now all of a sudden he's completely different with that and now saying I'm a European patriot. I know I keep talking about this, but it just, it kind of amazes me. I'm really fascinated by it. Okay, this is the first time I've heard him call Russia a bear. You know, the animal, the Russian bear, is a symbol of Russia. And I wonder how far that goes back. I don't remember it ever coming across it in pre-revolutionary texts. Anyway, so he was talking about the growth of anti-British sentiment. Obviously, Maria, she wanted Polly to be out of England, not primarily because of anti-British sentiment, but Dmitri was countering her idea that, yes, there's all this anti-British sentiment. But I understand now. I understand probably that sentiment was very present in the Russian emigre community because they had this idea that Dmitri mentions that the British were not bothered by communism and by the left-wing political parties in Britain, and that, well, Britain was at that time very, very actively courting Soviet Russia to be on their side against Hitler. And so this was causing people some alarm and some hard feelings. People who were strongly anti-Soviet didn't like that the British would be trying to win the Soviets over for an alliance. At that time, the Soviets and the Germans were in alliance. Okay, so, and he compliments the French. Oh, they're getting rid of their communist politicians, but in Britain, they love their communist politicians. Well, yeah. Anyway, clearly that's what was being said in emigre circles. So he'd seen this movie. I want to watch it now because it's actually on YouTube. It's from 1937. If you want to watch it on YouTube, just put in Peter the Great 1937, and it will come right up. I don't know if any of the links you can go to watch it on YouTube have it with English subtitles or not. I just don't know. But Dmitri had clearly seen this movie. It came out in 1937. He had seen it, sounds like recently. They had cinemas in Davos. Maybe he saw it in Davos. Maybe he'd seen it in Paris before he left. He refers to the pressure in the movie. He said watching this movie made him think of the pressure put on Ukraine and the Baltic. So the pressure was being put on Ukraine and the Baltic by the Germans in 1939. At the time of Peter the Great, it was, I think in the movie, it was primarily, he was fighting Charles XII of Sweden. Sweden was a great power, and it was Sweden that Russia was in this, sort of life and death struggle with. So that raises an interesting question on Dmitri and Ukraine. With everything that's going on right now, I'm hesitant to talk about anything related to that. But how did Dmitri feel about Ukraine? Well, unlike with Poland, he was adamant at this point that Ukraine must not be detached from Russia, that it was Russian and it should stay Russian. And there's something behind that, though, because the thing that's behind that is that the Nazis wanted to break Ukraine off and have it as a Nazi puppet state. And beyond that, they'd already made overtures and gotten a fairly receptive response from the documents that I've seen from Prince Vladimir Kirillovich, who was calling himself Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich and claiming to be, the head of the House of Romanov, if not the actual emperor in exile. And the Nazis had in mind making him the king of Ukraine. And Dmitri was just absolutely outraged by this, as you can imagine, just outraged by it. And, he made a public statement to the press that the Romanovs would never, ever have anything to do with Adolf Hitler. And so there was this, dispute between him and Vladimir. And he made statements about how, Ukraine was not going to, was not going to become a Nazi satellite state. And so, his strong conviction that it was part of Russia was a conviction that would have been shared at that time by most Russians, if not most Ukrainians. I don't know a lot about the Ukrainian independence movement at that time. There always had been a desire. There always had been a Ukrainian nationalist is the wrong idea, because that has connotations of authoritarianism and that sort of thing. But anyway, yes, this is a place where I can sink directly into a quagmire. Anyway, next time we'll have Dmitri talking more about Young Russia. He had now distanced himself from Young Russia. Young Russia was the political group that he'd been giving speeches for, the pro-Soviet political group that he'd been a very active member of. So he's going to be talking about that, which is really interesting. And then after that, he's going to do what he's told Maria already that he's going to do, which is to talk about what he's learned more about his physical situation, his health. So, I hope to see you next time. And I'm just in the apartment today. Kind of boring, but again, out of energy. All right, so take care. Thanks for watching. Bye.